I very much appreciate your balanced reporting and have for years, but I'm wondering, and maybe this is an unfair question, with regard to your colleagues, is there no such thing as anti-Israel bias, or for that matter, pro-Israel bias? And I'm thinking, what do you think of your colleagues at CNN or BBC or Time Magazine especially?
Well, let's deal with the Time Magazine part, and then I'll sort of answer that a little bit more broadly. What I assume you're referring to is a cover story about a month ago with a big Jewish star made out of flowers, and the headline being why Israel doesn't want peace?
Right,
Why Israel doesn't want peace, or why Israel doesn't need peace? Doesn't care, that's it. Why Israel doesn't care about peace. And this is important, and I'll explain why in a minute. Now, first of all, and this is something that it's really important to know, journalists don't write the headlines. Again, journalists don't write the headlines. Secondly, why Israel doesn't care about peace can be read two ways. It can be read why Israel doesn't want peace, which is how I think most of the Jewish community read it. And it can be read why Israel doesn't think that peace is possible. It can be read why Israel doesn't feel that peace is their first priority. If you read the story, as I'm sure you did, the story had to do about the town of Ashdod and people buying condominiums, and more about the Israeli economy and how robust the Israeli economy was. Now, there was one line in the story that I know got people a little bit upset where he wrote, the reporter, Israelis are making money, and people thought that was kind of a stereotypical response. But I think what the story said was basically, and in a way it's true, why many Israelis feel that at least at this point the chances of a peace deal are so remote that they've kind of given up on it. And it's not that they don't want peace. And I actually firmly believe that if a really serious peace deal was presented to both sides, they would take it. And that's something we can talk about a little bit more. But I think that, some of it is how you come to that reading. And I think the story itself was not objectionable. That's how I felt having read the story. The headline and the cover, now some of that, by the way, has to do with the iPad. This is kind of a secret, because people have stopped subscriptions, they're buying single issue magazines, and they're buying it based on the cover. If you look at the iPad or at these apps, you're buying it based on the cover. So there's been, and this is across the board, kind of a push to sort of jazz up or sensationalize the cover in order to get people to buy it. Beyond that, a broader issue of, is there anti-Israel bias? I think most journalists who are based in Israel study very hard and really do try to understand it. It's really complex, so those of you who've been involved in this kind of stuff know. There are issues where journalists are kind of parachuted in to do one story or two stories, and I think sometimes they don't have the context. I think also the European press tends to be much more anti-Israel than the American press. But what Rabbi Cohen started with, and I've heard this over and over, Israelis or American Jews really believe that the media is anti-Israel, and Arab Americans really believe that it's pro-Israel. And they really do believe this. And I think you can point to, individual cases. I also don't think, in other words, I don't believe in objective journalism. I don't think it exists. I try very hard to be balanced. Balance does not mean being objective. And I think that not every story there are stories that are done, has to have both viewpoints in them, and people who do this kind of work, sometimes, they'll count how many words are from the pro-Israel side, how many spokesmen did you get, where did they come from, do you have a pro-Israel, anti-Israel? I think there are stories that should be written from an Israeli perspective. There are stories that should be written from a Palestinian perspective. And throwing in some comment by a spokesman, I think it's just sort of silly. The question is, over time, are you getting context? Are you getting a broad, nuanced portrayal? And I think that's the goal, and it's really not an easy one. So that's how I'd answer. a long answer. Go ahead.
Completely different topic. Can you comment on Anat Hoffman and the Women of the Wall, and whether that is simply something that pushes the buttons of liberal Jews in the U.S., or whether it has any play at all in terms of the tenor of religious pluralism in Israel? And if you can go more broadly into whether you see any hope at all for any kind of real religious pluralism in Israel in a governmental level.
Okay. I'm sure most of you know, but for those of you who don't know, Women of the Wall is a group of women, most of them either American immigrants or, originally to Israel, or American tourists who join them, who come every month, and they go to the Western Wall on Rosh Chodesh, which has always been kind of a special holiday for women. And they have a women's service for Rosh Chodesh in which they sing out loud and they try to read the Torah. Now, it actually went to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled that the women were not allowed to sing out loud or to read the Torah at the wall itself, and that they had to go to another area sort of around the corner called Robinson's Arch, which is also part of the Western Wall. And I mean, from my perspective, Robinson's Arch is actually much nicer than the Western Wall, but that's another issue. And it's part of the wall as well. It's much quieter. It's much. I always, if I have friends coming to do bar mitzvahs for their kid in Israel, I always say do Robinson's Arch, don't do the Kotel, because the Kotel is sort of a zoo. It went all the way to the Israeli Supreme Court. And they have recently, one woman was arrested for carrying a Torah, and Anat Hoffman, who was a member of the Jerusalem City Council and who's actually a good friend of mine and a real firebrand, knows exactly what she's doing and has said to me, I'm trying to get myself arrested, and she was recently arrested for carrying the Torah. And I think the police are recommending that she be charged with violating this agreement that the Supreme Court ruled. Beyond that, and what happens to these women who come to the Western Wall is they are often attacked by men, ultra-Orthodox men, but even more by ultra-Orthodox women. Have any of you been there for this, by the way, for Women of the Wall? So it's the women who are actually worse than the men. Chairs have been thrown. The police are actually there to protect the women and to make sure that they don't get attacked. And the numbers are, I think, usually between 100, 150 women who come and do this. Is it going to affect Israeli pluralism, or is there any chance for Israeli pluralism? I don't think so. I think that Reform and conservative Judaism has a very small presence in Israel, even though most Israelis actually act like Reform or conservative Jews. They don't consider themselves Reform or conservative Jews. Most Israelis from like Arab countries, Iraq, Morocco, Yemen, are traditional. Their homes are kosher. They keep kosher. They celebrate Shabbat, perhaps not in a completely Orthodox way. They do celebrate Shabbat, but they call themselves traditional, Masorati. I don't really see Reform and conservative Judaism expanding and becoming really religiously pluralistic. However, what I do see happening, and this is kind of the ray of sunshine, is have you guys heard of what's called the Tali schools? These are secular schools that want to have Jewish enrichment. As I told you earlier, the secular schools, the kids come out knowing really almost nothing about Judaism, almost nothing. And these Tali schools, the schools are coming to the Ministry of Education and saying, we want more Jewish studies in the schools. And that's being brought in, that they want their kids to know more. But and maybe it will change, but Reform and conservative is seen as very American, not very Israeli. And I see my oldest son goes to there are very few schools like this. It's called religious pluralistic, meaning that most of the kids are not observant Jews, but the school, the boys have to wear a kippah. They have prayer every day, but you don't have to pray, but you have to go in order to enable those people who want to pray. And there, all of his friends who had bar mitzvahs, none of them are observant, and they all had bar mitzvahs in Orthodox synagogues. That's just the way that it is, and I don't know I think that somehow what the reform and conservative movement has to try to do is to reach out to Israelis. I think you have to figure out a way to get them in the door. I think if you got them in the door, they would say, oh, this is kind of nice. I think people are looking for spirituality. The other thing, and I think it's important, is that the only day off in Israel is Shabbat. So Friday, for most people, is a work day. It's a 6-day week. So the one day that you don't have to go to work, it's kind of hard to get people up and going to the synagogue. But I think the reform movement has been successful in reaching out in terms of study. And I think that's really, people are interested in study. Part of the problem is Israelis so associate Judaism with religious coercion that they don't want to have any part of it, unfortunately. Yeah.
It's so interesting after listening to you for many years to hear you say, I think Israel should do this or Israel shouldn't do that. And about objectivity, your colleague Juan Williams was let go, even though he was kind of an analyst for expressing an opinion. And the one that really struck me was during the 2006 Lebanon War, on CNN, seeing an on-air fight between Wolf Blitzer and Christian Amanpour, and seeing that tension really right out there. So I'm wondering, among your colleagues, when you're covering Israel, is that something that comes out? Is there an arbiter of that kind of thing? Are you all in?
No, I think, I think journalists are allowed to have opinions. And I don't think that it affects your coverage. I think having opinions can be good. In other words, and the fact that I'm critical of the state of Israel on religious issues, let's say, I don't think that affects my ability to cover the state of Israel. I think that, journalists are, there is this sort of idea. For example, NPR sent out a memo saying that nobody was even allowed to attend Jon Stewart's return to sanity. Now, I don't know that there was a similar memo for the Glenn Beck. I guess they felt it wasn't necessary. But I think that there is something to be said that you do have to, journalism should not be advocacy. And often when I'm, why don't you do more stories that are pro-Israel? Well, my job is not to be pro-Israel and not to be anti-Israel. I think it's to try to, give you the nuances and give you the depth. And I think that it is a thin line in a way, and journalists do have opinions. And I think that, I don't know that expressing those opinions are necessarily bad. And let's just leave it at that. I don't think I should comment specifically on Juan Williams.